Greetings, everyone. I wanted to share with you a perspective that, or maybe it's not a perspective, although it is a way of looking at it, utilizing available information, knowledge, comprehension, and experience analysis, and just throwing it all on the table and looking at it. And I, I've mentioned before, I use easel pads that are tacked to my walls and start writing, so it gives me this broader visual of what and how things connect together. Well, I also use other mediums of paper, like painter's paper or anything, where I could just use a few tacks, get it up on the wall, and just start writing it out. And that's what you're looking at in front of you. There's, if you look in the center, that circle, in the center of it, it says human suffering, and there's one piece of paper there, but behind that piece of paper are two other ones. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. This is how I dump out my mind. I have spent a lot of time in contemplation lately in the area of human suffering, just trying to understand it, because for me it has been at the root of my human experience. I have known suffering for most of my life. This isn't boo-hoo. I'm just saying, based off of all the variables involved, for better or for worse, the vast majority of what I've known in this life has been suffering of some kind, for a myriad of reasons. And I'm not in and putting that out there to be in judgment of it. That's just a causal factor in my, pardon me, in my desire to spend my time in analysis of what this human suffering thing is. Another reason that's motivated me to spend a little time contemplating this is some experiences I've had with ayahuasca relevant to beings feeding off of our negative energy, as well as some books that I've read, the Apocrypha, that gives a second side, another side of the story, and it alludes to us being designed to be fed on. And that feeding is energy-based. And then there's other traces and things that allude to the similar thing, the same theory, in like, there's the Black Book by Chris Hyatt. I've gotten this from more than one source, is what my point is, that there was part of the design in humans was energy beings, electrical beings, and all of these variables that make us really easily manipulatable, and that I've spoke of these in other videos, and that make it really easy for us to be squeezed. I see an underlying theme, and in some circles it's even accepted, some religious circles, relevant to sufferance, human suffering, and the fact that in the perversion that religion essentially is, they've convinced their flock of sheep that human suffering is a noble thing, and that it's good to suffer, and that it's just like, you got to be kidding me. It is just the most disempowering thing. So what I did was I wrote down the core of my experience in life, and then that, human suffering, more or less. And just started writing down lots of things, ideas, concepts, theories, analysis, findings type of thing, as to what these contributing factors are of human suffering. And I would say that it is everywhere, and that most things in this world are designed to induce or invoke some degree of suffering in us. That what put us here by design intended for us to suffer, because the energy that comes out of us to such a large degree on the whole is negative energy. So I'm going to take you on a little journey, and it's not going to be to just espouse lots of negative perspective. It's literally sharing with you my findings, and all of these findings and what analysis I have put into this all points to being causal factors to this human suffering thing. And try not to trivialize it in your head. Oh, you think you figured out the reason for human suffering? Just follow me on this. There's a lot to this equation. There's a lot more to this equation than you might think when you think about it on a surface level. So, human suffering. What is at the root of human suffering? If we listen to what the spiritual yogis, monks, and gurus say, desire is the root of all suffering. Desire is at the core of the human experience, though. So that's a paradox in and of itself, or seemingly a paradox, that we're going to design and create and breathe life into a race of intelligent, sentient beings, that part of the equation of their human experience will be that desire is at the root of their suffering, that they will know. Yet, we're going to make them beings that at their core of what drives them, this soul, this energy of sort that drives this being, that compels this being, the core of that will be desire itself. Desire is at the root of all suffering, so let's place that as the seed in the being. So desire begets everything that we do, from relieving ourselves and base level bodily functions to anything that's higher level. A desire to experience, a desire to learn, a desire to grow, a desire for procreation, a desire for connection, a desire for experience. Experience. That's what consciousness wants to do, is experience. Now, think about how this, real quick side note, think of how this construct is so designed to limit our experience, control it, regulate it, and it's just, wow. Yet at the core of what we are as souls that occupy a mitsu, that have the ability to have human experience, to fly, to swim, to just do all the things that we can do potentially, that's desire. And it's amazing how much human effort puts into putting the kibosh on our ability to experience those experiences, because it's all been based on money and all that other stuff. And then we're conditioned to believe that if we don't have or make lots of money, that we're shit and that we're not worthy of experiencing it. And then society has it set up so that you can't experience it unless you have this money thing. And it's like, wait a minute, the very core of the human is desire, which lends itself to wanting to experience. And then they put this mechanism to control what you can and will experience. And that's just man's, one piece of what man has added to that equation. I'm more referring to at the underlying, the base of this is the causal factors of the suffering. It was our design, our engineered makeup. So think about it. Really quick, high level, if you followed my stuff, you've heard me say this. Our minds were firewalled off, the brain with 20% at the highest levels. We can't take in too much information too fast and comprehend it all because of the energy that it takes from us. We shut off. There's been DNA firewalled off in us. The inward journey has been largely firewalled off in us. Connectedness to any of these extra sensory perceptions that we might otherwise have has been firewalled off in most of us. It's clear they turned off DNA to prevent us from rising to a level that they are, or beyond, or anything even close to it. And with all of that being what it is, part of the engineering of us was this desire. And then the equation, one of the equations, and it's one of the underlying ones because it freaking happens to us all. Love is not a guarantee in this human 3D construct paradigm, but suffering is. Don't care who you are. I don't care if you're royalty. You're going to know even some level of suffering. And below that proverbial capstone-ish thing, all of us will know suffering. All of us. That's the point I'm trying to make. All of us will know suffering. So it is one of the foundational pieces of the equation of the human experience. Something designed it that way. Could have been love. They could have just removed that little piece and put in love. Love is the root of everything for the human. And we grow through loving each other and loving the environment and loving our world, and the energy and resonance and frequency of love could have been. But what designed us doesn't feed off that. That is too conducive to profound amounts of growth and attainment of higher levels of existence if we evolve freely from that mode of conditioning, programming, being designed. That we evolve from an equation in our human experience that is, love is the root of the human experience rather than suffering. So, desire is at the root of suffering, desire is at the core of the human experience, and desire begets intention, which begets will, which begets action for the human to do and create any of the stuff that we experience in this life, or anything at all. Also, it is said that attachment is said to be at the root of all suffering. And that when you start thinking about the way this human experience is designed, the way we work, it's all about attachments, connections to people, family, friends, hell, pets, for crying out loud, or any other thing. Most of us, by design, will become attached to things, to people, to relationships, to things. Yet none of the things that we get attached to are permanent. So family members die and families fall apart. Friends become not friends anymore or move away. Boyfriends and girlfriends, they break up. Husbands and wives break up. Blah, blah, blah. There's just so much of this stuff that we get attached to that causes us suffering, sorrow, heartache, mourning. You know what I mean? Where we're praying, worshiping, praying for relief, release, freedom. So desire and attachment, by way of the spiritual circles of circles of monks, yogis, gurus, and all these people say that desire and attachment, depending on which philosophy you subscribe to, is at the root of all of this stuff. Yet at the very core of what the human being is, we're going to experience desire and attachment all over the place. All of that directly lends itself to human suffering. So, the yogis, monks, gurus, and people like that say, release desire, release attachment, or let go of your thoughts, release your thoughts, free yourself from your mind, let your thoughts just go by. Disconnect from most of the core aspects of your humanness and core aspects of your human experience, which are desire, attachment, maybe love, thought, and experience. Do you see what I'm saying? There's absolute conflict in the way that we were designed and what we are going to innately and inherently do, or at least it would seem that way to me. Yet, when you look at the spiritual yogis, monks, gurus, etc., 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 say it again, etc., etc., all these spiritual people, I've been using a lot of etc., etc. in a few videos, and I caught that, and I'm like, well, I'm just hoping most people get what I'm saying, so I don't have to go on these longer tirades of including everything that I assume most people will understand what I'm referring to. So anyway, I don't want to digress too much. I just find it bizarre that there seems to be even paradox in that. That the people that most of us on the planet will consider to be like the spiritual level people, monks, Buddhist monks, yogis, gurus in India and Tibet and all these other places, the people that have been at this stuff, studying the inner workings of the mind, the human experience, or whatever it is they claim to be mastering. Desire, release it. Attachment, release it. Let go of your thought. I'm like, wait a minute. We were born to be intelligent, critically thinking beings, and we're not designed with any innate knowledge of how to disconnect thought, how to turn off the mind. Or what would we be as a species without desire? And maybe on some levels, the attachment is necessary as well. If it's not necessary, it's damn sure an obvious and integral part of the human makeup, the bonding and the psychology behind it, the energy behind it, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so much of what I consider to be a conflict of the base programming of the human being versus the base programming of the construct we're put in, if that makes sense. The base programming of the human experience versus what the spiritual yogis and gurus will tell us, and that is, quiet your mind. It's like, I'm a thinking being. Everything that I experience comes from, for the most part, thought. And it can take years to figure out how to slow down your mind because, we're designed to be thinking beings. Yet somehow there's advancement as a being of intellect and sentience and all that other stuff in disconnecting yourself from this piece of yourself that you were designed to do. I've heard so much in the way of negative connotations to, we've got ourselves here because we're all trapped in our heads and we're not in our hearts. I don't know who is putting this shit forward or why people believe this stuff. Oh, because somebody who appears to be spiritual to them said something that kind of sounds good, and they just latch onto it. And, oh boy, never mind. I don't want to digress on that too much. But I hope people see what I'm talking about, that there's these fundamental conflicts or paradoxes, but not good paradoxes at all, in the foundational aspects of what created, or of our design versus some foundational aspects of the design of the human experience, the equations that make all these things up. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, because we are psychological beings, we are so easily manipulated or affected by negative things. Let's say it's not manipulation, it's just being affected by some negative shit that went on in or around me. We can either be manipulated in ways that are very unhealthy, that totally screw us up, or we can be traumatized, or we can be, let me just run down a few things at a high level, just subject matters that we can all agree are part of the human experience, have been part of the human experience, and absolutely lend themselves to deep amounts of suffering. And There's a reason for this that I'm pointing all this out. So we have abuse that we see on varying levels of children, of people who are weak, of people that are at a disadvantage. Abuse is taking place on levels physical, psychological, mental. I guess that's psychological. Massive amounts of traumas that people experience from abuses or from other negative things that have taken place around or near them. So abuses, traumas, slavery, and all of the abuse and trauma that's associated to that. Human beings on lots of levels and throughout the course of time have experienced neglect and all these things. We also, religions and all this other crap has gotten into sacrifices, and then that is inflicting lots of traumas. All of this affects the human mind, the human psychology, and ultimately human behavior. This is huge because that type of stuff, these things that seem so predominant in the human experience, abuse, trauma, slavery, neglect, and sacrifice. And why I say sacrifice is because these secret societies, these people at the top, these people who are into this negative, evil shit have been killing people and sacrificing them for a very long time. It's part of what lends itself to human suffering. The agony, the suffering, the fear of those experiences that people would go through, it contributes to human suffering on a lot of levels, and they've been doing it for a very long time. So in the design, in the engineering, in the architecture of us, there are these equations that all point to human suffering, all lend themselves to easily pointing and guiding the human to an experience of suffering. We're born ignorant, and because we're born ignorant, we're easily manipulatable by people who are not, or by beings who are not ignorant, that actually possess knowledge and then want to use that knowledge over you. So we're born ignorant, then we're easily manipulatable. Another reason why we're easily manipulatable is that we are emotional beings that are born ignorant. Therefore, if we are lied to, manipulated in unsavory ways, there's just born ignorant, easily manipulatable emotional beings, or emotional beings that are born ignorant, that are easily manipulatable, however you want to look at it. And on top of that equation being there, we don't have much in the way of little to no instinct about how to defend this stuff, how to defend our minds, how to defend our beings so that we can grow into healthy beings. So much of what determines our health as a being comes from our psychological and emotional makeup, yet there are so many forces and factors out there that are absolutely destroying many of these aspects of the human in its developmental processes so that it develops in a toxic way. Like epigenetics, for instance. Epigenetics is a reflection of the environment that something is in and how it causes things to express, et cetera, et cetera. It makes sense. On top of being born ignorant, easily manipulatable emotional beings that have little to no instinct about how to protect ourselves or navigate these aspects of the equation that make us such fodder and so easily manipulatable, we are psychologically compartmentalized as well. So let's say you get a whole bunch of negative shit when you're young, and that becomes a part of what you grow into, or aspects of it, which lends itself to you experiencing suffering because, well, you were fed a bunch of toxic shit. Then you don't have access into that. I guess the psychological compartmentalization ensures that we won't, once we hit a level of awareness and consciousness, have any direct impact or easily accessible direct impact to clean up any garbage that's within these core aspects of what drives the show. We have the conscious, the subconscious, the egoic mind, et cetera, these pieces of us. All of them seem to serve different purposes, yet we don't have any direct control over the most important aspects of what's driving the show, because the information that gets put into the driver's seat, so to speak, is a lot of what we're programmed with when we're kids. And if we're born into families where our parents are profoundly ignorant, we don't stand a chance against those who are not, especially those who are not and then will not and do not share information so that they can maintain power. It's amazing when you start looking at these equations and factoring them all in to a grander whole, when you see them all as causal factors behind this whole of human suffering. So I've also suggested in other videos that humanity has been guided and steered, directed, manipulated into this state of suffering. And when you look back at the course of history, there's a lot of evidence based off of the history that we do have and what we don't, or what we do know, that this negative human suffering experience has been with us forever. From, slavery to disease to war, hunger, starvation, Emotions cause suffering. Religion has caused suffering. Rulers, conquerors, and all that stuff caused suffering. The Crusades, the plagues, genocide, democide, slavery in the various forms that we now see with debt slavery. Interest has caused suffering. Money has caused suffering. War has caused all of these things. These are all things that have been with humanity. Humanity has been stimulated into suffering using these various mechanisms for 7,000 years. And what's even crazier is that all of these things I'm referring to are kind of repeating cycles. So it's not as if we're learning from them. It's not as if they're really teaching the whole of humanity. Because by the time the whole of humanity starts to get it, then generations die off and we have these young ones that don't get it, that have to figure it out. And they can induce these cycles where we're repeating the same stuff, as that theme seems to be with us, repeating the same things. Well, why the hell are we doing this? It's not, is it because we're stupid? I don't think so. But we're not learning, is what I'm suggesting, from all of these things that are inducing this human suffering. We're not learning because we're repeating the same cycles. Or is it that because of how do I say this? Maybe as we begin to learn this, things end up taking place to disconnect us from this. A generation or two goes by, and then we begin to forget. Because, we begin to forget. And then it breeds the ability for us to continue to repeat the same cycles. And the reason that would even work or be part of the deal is if we're continuously repeating the same cycles, the same of slave, war, death, destruction, money slavery, interest slavery, debt slavery, plagues, crusades, religious type shit, blah, 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 blah. It just continues to breed the same end result of human suffering. That is the underlying thing in all of this that I'm explaining, is that there are so many of these variables, these factors that appear to be contained within these equations that make up the human being or the human experience, that all lead to and have an ultimate outcome that has suffering tied to it, as a part of it, rooted in it, any of these things. It's just like, you really, really, really got to be kidding me. And some of these mechanisms may have come from out of this world, like diseases and plagues and things of that nature, in an effort to thin the herd or to induce a lot of suffering because everybody around you is dying. Therefore, those people who see those dying around them are going to get down on their knees and worship, and they're going to be suffering from the loss of their loved ones. So all of the various pieces of this puzzle don't show the work of benevolence. They really don't. It lends itself to the fact that something truly did do, as I'm alluding, create us for the purpose of feeding off of us, designed us to be beings that will suffer, put us into an equation or an experience, a 3D experience, 4D experience, where some of the most foundational equations that run the experience mean that you will suffer. That suffer drives the human to their knees. And what that means is you're going to pray or worship this being that created you to feed from you, because in the negative of the human suffering and that energy coming out of you, you're feeding them what they call food, loosh, or some people call it sloosh, and it's food for the gods or the aliens or both. Apparently, this negative energy that comes out of us is so abundant and so nutrient dense for them that they've been with us for at least 7,000 years. When you start looking at, for instance, the stories in the Bible, it's amazing how wrathful, vengeful, spiteful, and many other adjectives that describe something that is not very benevolent, and what it does to humans that don't listen to it, bow down to it, worship it, blah, blah, blah. You hear the stories of what was done to Job. We hear the stories of, what was it, Abraham or Isaac or somebody that literally was told to go and sacrifice his son for blood offerings. This quote unquote God, sacrifice a ram, sacrifice a lamb, sacrifice a bull, give blood to it. The fact that the religious movement gave birth to the religious crusades that went out and slaughtered more people in the name of religion and the supposed God that loves us all, And they'll give you reasons of saying, well, man was perverted and we had to wipe it. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. It's that this thing is violent and evil at its core. And in that place, it created a bunch of sentient beings to suffer so that it could feed from it. Now think about that. These are aspects of this equation that most people refuse to accept, refuse to consider, refuse to believe. It's too much for their paradigms. It's too much for what they think they know. It's too much in comparison to all this shit that we've been told. They have consistently, by way of a hell of a case of Stockholm Syndrome, even fed the narrative that was indoctrinated into their minds by the religious mechanism that's on this planet to drive these seeds deep into the psyche of man so that it becomes one of the biggest sources of human suffering. And that the byproduct, one of the byproducts of breaking out of mental slavery, breaking out of indoctrination, breaking out of ignorance is going to be a degree of suffering of the human mind, because it's going to be finding information all over the place that is so in contrast to everything it's ever been told and taught. Then it has to get to the point where it accepts that everything that it's been told and taught has all been a lie, and that there's been maliciousness involved in the whole process, and accepting that all of these things I'm referring to are conducive to human suffering. You know, and then ultimately, one of the things that I find to be very interesting that seems to be to have increased more and more and more over time, and I think it's because of another design flaw or something that's been designed and or conditioned into us, is that no matter what happens to us humans, and most of it in this context is inflicted upon us by other humans, but some of it is inflicted upon us by the quote unquote gods, is that for whatever reason, rather than banding together, rising up, or doing any meaningful thing to make any of the shit that is so negative that causes a lot of it to go away and not exist anymore in this existence, is that we've been designed or conditioned to accept it. And that acceptance may come from a place of being completely disempowered and in fear of our supposed God. And because it's God, well, what can we do? We just have to accept it. And it's consistently beaten and conditioned into the minds and the psyche of humans to accept all of this negative shit that has gone on all around us that has been a source of human suffering. We've become more and more tolerant of some of the worst atrocities that have taken place. We think back on history and even in current times. We become very tolerant, very accepting of these things that are profoundly affecting the human experience and adding to negative, low base level emotions, experiences, frequencies. We adapt to it. We're designed to adapt to these kinds of things. We just simply get used to it. Think about that. Rather than doing anything to change it, rather than doing anything to grab the proverbial horse by the reins, the bull by the nose in its, or the ring in its nose, or by the horns, or anything that has us in control for some meaningful, beneficial purpose for the whole of humans, we've not done that because we've been conditioned into this place of acceptance and tolerance, adaptation, getting used to what's doing this to us. And in some cases, we've been brainwashed into worshiping what's doing this to us when it's coming from these beings or being outside of this world. That is, when you start looking at some of the mathematical equations, and I say that in a metaphor, because they're not necessarily mathematical equations that I can quantify, but I think it's a good enough metaphor for people to see what it is that I'm saying, that all these factors are at play. You know, if this, then that. It's almost like an equation, so it fits. I can't see that there's a whole lot of our design or the design of the construct that we were put into to experience what we are told is life, that has been or is rooted in love, benevolence, quote unquote holiness, purity, any of these good things. Look at what all this stuff that we've been experiencing as human beings has produced on this earth and in this world. And don't just default to your programming that somebody else gave you that says, oh, it's the devil's work. Come on now. Also, another aspect of this most of us don't consider, or that I've considered and I'm just putting out there as something for other people to consider. In the effort to ensure that we're going to suffer, we were designed in all the ways that I've told you. And then here's another one. We were designed to be self-contained pharmaceutical dispensaries. Think about it. A experience in the human perception of the world equals a chemical being emitted into the brain by one of the glands. Those chemicals create feelings or induce emotions that cause thoughts that induce more chemicals, and there's a whole snake eating its tail in that equation. And when we're manipulated by our own kind or by outward forces into this negative stuff, that whole snake eating its tail becomes this spinning energy of negativity, where you're conditioned into a place where you're thinking causes you to emit chemicals in your brain that add more of that feeling that's aligned with the thinking, when if the thinking is a byproduct of the experienced reality that has been largely turned into a perversion and toxified version of a human experience by way of men. And it's just amazing how this thing feeds on itself. So when you think of the chemicals that are squirted out into our minds that also feed into this thinking pattern, this is a vulnerability that can be exploited. I think in computer terms in a lot of ways, and this makes sense. This is a vulnerability that was, I think, designed into the human being so that it could be easily exploited as a mechanism to extract and create negative emotions in human beings, that negative energy that comes from suffering and conflict and limitations and all that other stuff that we experience, and greed. And so the emotions do one major thing above all else, it would appear. Could be lacking in some perspective, but this is what I see. That these emotions disrupt logic and reason. And that's what keeps us sane in a lot of respects. Logic and reason. So the emotions disrupt logic and reason. The emotions can be manipulated. The emotions are created by the chemicals that are based off of the experience and all that other stuff. So this is why we hear certain people, spiritual masters, psychological masters, whatever it is that these people are, most of you will recognize what I'm saying here in a second, is that this is why we're supposed to control our emotions. Think about that. So we were given this thing that we recognize are called emotions. They're induced by chemicals that are squirted into the brain by the glands that were given to us that contain these chemicals that we continuously produce more of. We have an experience, and let's just say negative. In the context of what I'm referring to, most of this being negative experiences to induce negative energy, negative human experience, suffering to feed something else. So we're designed as this pharmacological dispensary. We experience something, produces a chemical, creates an emotion, creates that snake eating its tail. The obviousness of the emotions being a mechanism to disrupt logic and reason. Think about how many times you've gotten angry and did stupid shit, fell in love and did stupid shit. It's all by design. So we're given this thing called emotions that literally are designed to disrupt logic and reason. We're supposed to control them. Now, why would we work so hard to control something that our Creator gave to us? Really? He gave us something that was out of control and without training and knowledge. Oh, some of that stuff that we weren't given by way of any inherent instinct or anything like that. To be able to control these things called emotions that we get that screw up the experience, that cause us to say things. If you don't control your emotions, maybe you could say things. Well, the Bible talks all about, as an example, lots of spiritual texts as well, talk about controlling the tongue and what you say. Well, what causes people to not control their tongue or say shit they wouldn't otherwise say? Emotions get involved, anger, whatever it might be. This equation, it was all designed that way. It's one of the sources, I think it's one of the biggest things that causes us to be manipulated is our emotions. It makes us vulnerable. Emotions can make us weak. Can they make us stronger? Sure, if the right equation and you get good ones. But that's not what we see to such a large degree. I'm talking about the whole of humanity, the whole of the collective experience, the whole of the suffering that we see in the stories and what we know about human history, the whole of how most things that people who have gotten to any level of maturation and awareness will begin to see are part of this bigger equation that feeds negative, or that induces negativity into the paradigm, into the system, or the mental processes, the human experience, all of it designed to induce more suffering. All of this generally causes us to emit this negative energy. Part of a flaw in the design, well, an inherent flaw. Maybe they don't consider it to be a flaw. Maybe it's absolute perfection for what it is their outcome and ultimate goal was. But in comparison to what I consider to be a well-built, well-balanced, sentient being that has some purpose beyond being a source of food, and that the only reason it was given sentience and awareness and what it has is so that I could see the nature of its suffering and its cage and what's being done to it, to just add to the degree of suffering that it is experiencing and that it knows. So it's the very act of giving it sentience causes it to feed on itself, meaning the energy suffering feeds in on itself. Because, it's amazing. So when you look at it, we were designed to be limited beings that have firewalled brains, minds, DNA, inward journeys firewalled off. We are designed in a way that makes it so that we can easily be stimulated and manipulated. We suffer from this thing for thousands of years now called money. and think about how much that man-made creation has induced suffering on levels that are just hard for the human mind to fully comprehend, and all the various ways and the web of cause and effect that money has had in suffering in human experience, and the perversions that it's caused to manifest in the minds of humans with regards to greed and all that other stuff. Money has induced as much or more suffering on this planet than religion and all that other stuff. And it's funny how some of that's even motivated by money. A lot of the killing and death, destruction, and wars that we see is in the conquest for money. And it's amazing. All of this alluding to human suffering. All of these things that I'm referring to have their core tenet, their core purpose in being being injected into our experience and being created and being part of the equation of the human experience to induce human suffering. We were put into this construct where all of these things that I'm referring to seem to be like rules of the game, and if we're unaware of the rules about how we work, or unaware of how to control the things that make us up, emotions and blah, blah, or the mind, whatever it may be that we need to control. It's like these are rules of this game that we're thrust into without any knowledge, awareness, that we accepted it, that we signed some contract, soul contract, or any of this shit that we agreed to. There are rules to the game that are hidden, basically. We're not taught about these rules. We're not given any innate knowledge or instinct of these rules. We're not given any knowledge of any of this stuff by default to give us half a chance of not suffering. It's like you've got all these faculties, but you're a blank slate. And because you have no base knowledge, because you have nothing, the process of you figuring out is damn sure going to be a lot of suffering, and you'll learn through the suffering. That's another one of the bizarre paradoxes of this equation of the human experience as we know it. All this suffering that I'm talking about and pointing to all of these various aspects of the human experience that have been with us from the beginning, it would seem, are so conducive to human suffering that I think ultimately feeds what designed us, and it's all purpose built for it to feed itself. And as much as I can, lambast what they did, why they did it, and all that, there is one little thing. You can't argue this. I don't think anybody can argue this. Like it or lump it, there is growth and learning that can come from suffering. To a large degree, for many people, those things don't come from suffering. What comes from suffering is more anger, more jadedness, more a snake eating its tail that makes people angry and jaded and, depressed and all these other things. And that is what happens to a lot of people. Some people can break out of it. Some people can, as you break out of it, you could turn around and look at it and say, wow, I learned a lot from it. But I think that's more of a side effect, that there can be learning from it, that there certainly is learning in it for the right people, but not everybody that experience it are going to learn from it. So it's not a definitive, it's not a etched in stone rule. Yet we're told that the suffering is designed to teach the human and the soul's journey, and all this ridiculous, sounds good, feels good, tickle your butt with cotton balls, kind of foofy stuff that we're told doesn't make sense, doesn't fit. I think it's what we're told. It's what we're given when we're at a lesser level of knowledge, awareness, consciousness. We don't have a broader sense of perception when these concepts are given to us. We may be young and stupid and ignorant, and just not knowing, or we may be just naive and a little older and in a process of searching and seeking. And simply because somebody sounds like they know what they're talking about, maybe there's somebody that, wears beads around their neck and wears, robes or something. Well, they must know what they're talking about. And I think a lot of what floats around in a lot of these spiritual circles would be likened to something like conventional wisdom. And there's a lot of aspects of conventional wisdom that totally disempower us, and you really can't trace the roots of it. And you got to wonder where the hell the conventional wisdom comes from, because a lot of it just doesn't have any place in a society full of critically thinking people. Well, that same scenario seems to have manifested itself in a lot of these spiritual communities where we tell ourselves things that just seem, when you really start looking behind the veil or behind the curtain of the proverbial topic and seeing what's behind it, it's so absurd. They sound good. Oh yes, human suffering is the journey of the soul and blah, 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 all this roses that they'll put around the whole concept of human suffering, that there's some noble thing in it and that it's for the benefit of the soul, and just accept it, be tolerant of it, adapt to it, get used to it, that's just going to be part of your human experience. And in that, your soul is going to grow. This part of you that you're really not aware of, you're told you have it. You're told you have it. But, whether or not any of what we're experiencing in this 3D, 4D experience, is that really doing anything for our soul? Or is our soul thrust in here because something else that's smarter than us or more knowledgeable than us trapped our souls and keeps putting us through this recycling process? And in doing so, it feeds off the negative energy through this recycling process, this self-sustaining source of energetic food. I tell you, people, it fits. It fits, it fits, it fits. And not in the way that O.J. Simpson's glove fit. This fits really well. It makes more sense to me at 46 years old in contemplation of all the stuff that I know we're all told. I mean, I got my fair share of religious indoctrination as well. Reading the Bible, being preached to, going to church, Catholic boarding school for a time. I'm walked the Christian walk, for better or for worse, for 18 years or something. I'm not ignorant to this stuff. So I've taken all of the shit that we're told. I've taken all of the stuff that we're told. I've taken everything that I figured out for myself, walking away from the box. I've taken what I've seen through deep entheogenic journeys in the jungle with shaman, some of my own deep entheogenic journeys by myself. I've taken what I've heard from other people who have had experiences that seem to parallel mine or have deduced or concluded similar things by way of potentially different experiences, but all leading us to believe, okay, a lot of us that go down this path, there's a lot more to what this is than we've been told. I don't know. Tell you, just like Jordan Maxwell says, nothing in this world works the way you think it does. It's amazing how true that man was with that. I mean, nothing we've been told is true. Most of our perceptions aren't rooted in reality. Something has really sought to it, to absolutely pervert human perception, pervert the human mind, pervert the human experience. And if they didn't intend to do this, it was designed this way. And it just took us waking up and stepping into consciousness to begin to identify it as such. I wonder if the stories of the Tower of Babylon or Tower of Babel are true, why would we start getting out? I mean, if this God was so loving and benevolent and all this other stuff, why would we have tried to reach the heavens? Why would we have tried to get out? Why would we have tried to do something that's so enraged, quote unquote, the gods, where they came down here and knocked it all down, destroyed everything, obfuscated our language? When you start looking at that, what stories we do have about the quote unquote gods and what impact they have had on us negatively to set us back, to pit us against each other, to continue to add to the suffering equation. This is crazy. And I will leave you with this. I can only conclude that it would take somebody who's experienced predominantly a life of suffering to be able to flesh out this stuff, to analyze this stuff, to be willing to look underneath the rug of a lot of these things, because at the core of their experience has been suffering, and they've gotten to a point where they're like, what the hell is this all about? This is a lot to absorb. This is a lot to take in. A lot of this will defy most of what we've been told in regards to who and what we are. A lot of people probably won't accept it. A lot of people will be like, well, that's one way of looking at it, and choose not to really consider it. There's all kinds of variations in what could happen, but this is the truth as I see it. This is a piece of the truth, a piece of the equation. I don't know how big yet. I don't know how big it is, but I would love for somebody, I mean, I've had the picture up, not that you can read it all, but this is how I do it. I literally start writing it all down. And this piece of paper I got here is about 8 feet wide. From left to right, there's a lot of information there, a lot of concepts, theories, things that are all tying in that point to that central circle of human suffering. It points to the fact that something put a lot of work into this. It points to the fact that there's a lot of thought that went into this experience, because look at all these equations I'm able to find that directly relate to human suffering. But God loves you. Get on your knees, because this God, who's all-seeing, all-knowing, all-wise, omnipotent, all-loving, all-forgiving, all these things that we're told it is, it's so, what do you call it, hung up on itself, that it needs you to get on your knees and worship it. Think about that equation. Worship me. You created your kids. Do you require your kids to get on your knees and worship you? Would any loving thing really require you to get on your knees and worship it? And if you didn't, make you suffer? When you look at the stories that we're told about Adam and Eve, they simply ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. They stepped into knowledge, and because of that, were cast out, All of their subsequent progeny would suffer, etc., pain in childbirth and labor, sweat of your brow through labor, and all the things that have been more conducive to human suffering. But people have somehow believed that this was a benevolent God, that it kicked us all out, and all. It's just amazing what we have accepted, what we have believed, what men have told us, what has been crafted for us to believe. And the worst part about it is, if these stories are true, oh, that's some sick shit. That this is really what this is. That this is really what's been done to us, and really why. Because here's the thing, let's say this is all a parasite. Let's say this has all been done to us by a race of beings outside of what this benevolent God created. Let's say we're all, as a species, we've been victimized because of whatever. Where is this benevolent force to come and help us ignorant little pink lab mice of the universe that would, assist something that the grander cosmic community was watching to grow and all that other stuff? Where is any good thing out there that has intervened in some way? I mean, certainly we hear the theories and concepts of free will, right? But it seems quite evident, self-evident, that a lot of our free will is manipulated, that things outside of this world can intervene and manipulate us. So free will may not necessarily be everything we think it is. It's amazing. There's just a lot of pieces of this equation that I think not enough people actually contemplate and think about, that all point to a lot of not so friendly, not so nice, not so happy, not so loving, not so benevolent, not so love and light, not so rainbows and fairy dust stuff. But we've gotten used to it. A lot of people just stop thinking about it because it's just the way it is. Anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Take it easy, people. I hope I have been able to at least induce you to contemplate things that you have not before.